Kathleen Marshall hadn't been seen for days.
Kathleen!
Inside her veterinary surgery below the house, the reason was clear, but the motive for her murder would remain a mystery.
For want of motive, we had a disagreement, a known disagreement between two people.
It was obviously identified that it was a crime of passion. This was someone who had a real problem with the deceased.
And Glenda said, oh, the murderer's just driven past. I was horrified.
Jeff Marsh turned round to me and said, did you murder her?
So, of course, I was under the suspicion that we were all suspects.
At this point, he began to physically shake, almost to the point where it was uncontrollable.
He refused to talk to me unless he could read my cards to find out whether I was a person suitable to be spoken to. So we had to get him. We had to get information from him.
Kathleen rang 000 on the phone. She said there's a mad woman in the house.
Let me in.
She wasn't happy at all that we were there.
Can't you shut that door?
This case was bizarre.
Kathleen Marshall's murder investigation would be dominated by rumours, catfights and psychic consultations. Everyone had their view on who killed Kathleen, but it was the forensics that would separate the fact from fiction in this very bizarre case.
Kathleen! Kathleen!
I arrived at Kathleen's house and Glenda and Robert and Sandra were standing on the front steps.
This is strange, isn't it?
They'd been knocking on the door, calling out to Kathleen.
She's just not answering.
I'll go and get the key.
And I was starting to get a bit concerned that maybe she'd had a stroke or something like this. Glenda came running up the side, calling out, Robert, Robert, are you there? There's flies, blood and a smell. And we went up to Kathleen's surgery. The smell, it was obviously the smell of something that was dead in the surgery. We didn't know what to think, but yet you could see the outline of one arm. And we didn't want to face the fact that it was Kathleen who was dead in the surgery.
The grisly scene was discovered late this afternoon. Friends of the woman arrived for a meeting, but no one responded. Then one of the group noticed blood on an outside door. They looked through a window and found more blood on the floor.
Our initial observations were focused upon the entry to the surgery. The surgery door was stained in blood. On the exterior side of the front door, there were swipe marks associated with the door lock. There was blood also on a mat, and there were spatter patterns of blood on the vegetation to the left-hand side of the doorway.
The deceased's body was located with her head towards the front right-hand corner of the surgery, with her legs pointing on a diagonal back towards the back left-hand corner. Her dress was blood-soaked, and there was a large amount of blood around the deceased.
With a large amount of blood present on the floor of the surgery, we used crime scene steps to enable us to walk through the scene without contaminating the blood upon the floor. There was a lot of dilute blood staining around the sink, both within the sink, on the taps, and more importantly, associated with a plastic bag on the left-hand side of the sink. Beneath the sink, a bucket contained a blood-stained Chuck's wipe. Now, it indicated to us that a very poor attempt had been made to clean the area. Now, whether that was an attempt to clean the blood of the body of the deceased, or to clean blood perhaps left behind by the perpetrator.
The body had a number of what appeared to me to be stab or incision wounds. There was a large number had been through clothing and the brassiere as well.
In fact, the 54-year-old vet, who lived alone with her 22 cats and 2 dogs, had been stabbed more than 50 times.
Due to the sheer amount of stab and incision wounds, it was obviously identified that it was a crime of passion, that this wasn't just an opportunist, this was someone who had a real problem with the deceased.
Police say she'd been stabbed repeatedly. She'd died as she'd lived, fighting to the end.
It seems as though, from the injuries, that it was a frenzied attack and that the deceased has tried to defend herself.
There was physical evidence of a scuffle within the surgery. There was a section of louver windows which had shattered, and the glass from those windows had fallen into the garage on the other side. That suggested to us that there was a scuffle within the surgery, and a person or persons have come in contact with the glass window and perhaps may have suffered injuries as a result. And our hopes were relying upon that person doing that and us discovering the blood at the scene.
As crime scene investigators collected blood samples in the hope that the killer had been injured in the struggle, they were alerted to some blood-stained clothes found only minutes away.
In the initial stages of the investigation, a mail bag, which contained bloodied shoes, arrived at the Northgate Mail Centre. The collection of that mail bag also indicated it was collected within certain hours, a number of hours prior to the body being located. That was obviously an area of investigation that we had to follow.
We conducted a search of a number of post boxes within the area. We came across a post box and the inside was blood stained. We observed a trail of blood leading from the post box. Our thoughts were that an offender perhaps had discarded his clothing or her clothing within the post box to conceal the crime.
But was the blood on those items Kathleen Marshall's? And if so, whose clothes were they? Brisbane vet Kathleen Marshall had been found stabbed to death in her surgery, and police believed they were on the trail of her killer. In a post box just a short distance away, they'd found discarded bloody clothing.
Scientific attended that scene of that mailbox and conducted investigations there and took blood samples, etc. But we were able to identify very quickly that the blood trail led to a smashed window where a store had been broken into. Also led to a phone box next to the mailbox. We were able to trace the phone calls from that phone box to the Queensland Ambulance Service, who had collected a patient from that location who was suffering a deep cut to his legs. That person was quickly identified, still in the Royal Brisbane Hospital, was interviewed and subsequently charged with offences not related to this matter.
But the police knew that it was likely that the killer had left his calling card in the surgery. 25 samples of blood spattered throughout the crime scene had been collected for forensic testing in hope of finding the killer's DNA and his or her identity. Meanwhile, detectives were upstairs, discovering further evidence.
Kathleen Marshall was a lover of music. In the main lounge area, she had a piano. During the course of searching around the residence, I noticed that sheet music was open on the piano. Upon looking at it further, I noticed that it was a death march, and I thought this was very strange. Had someone been upstairs and turned it specifically to those pages?
Kathleen's house certainly gave detectives the impression that was the case.
The residence was messed up, in a dishevelled state, with newspapers on the floor, bed was messed up. But it wasn't until through further investigations that we identified that this was the way that the deceased conducted her normal business.
Late today, the animals she'd sheltered were being removed from her home while SES volunteers combed the neighbourhood for a possible weapon or clues. Police want to hear from anyone who can help them piece together Kathleen Marshall's last movements on the weekend.
In the property of Kathleen Marshall, we discovered a small personal diary which had identified certain appointments that she had for the Thursday. There was an appointment at 12:30 for a gentleman with his dog, obviously a veterinary appointment, and at 1 o'clock there was an appointment for a gentleman with a cat. The appointment for the man with the dog, it actually gave his full name, and he was able to tell us that as he left, he remembered seeing an old couple arrive.
And I saw a man walking down the road towards Kathleen's place, and he had a Siamese seal point cat. The ears stand out. He was holding it like so, you know, with the cat there. Oh, they said to Kathleen, oh, this looks like your 1 o'clock appointment. And she said, oh, probably it would be.
Away we went, and that was the last I think, we ever saw of Kathleen Marshall.
So during the door knocks, one of the areas that we were looking at was that anyone had a Siamese cat, and we couldn't identify that person.
As police continued their quest to find John Wilson and others who saw Kathleen Marshall during the last few days of her life, her answering machine was providing a vital clue in determining the time of death.
Have you gone away, Kath? I'm trying to get hold of you before our concert tonight, so do give us a ring.
We were able to ascertain from listening to her recorded messages on her answering machine that she did not return any telephone calls post 6 p.m. on the Thursday, and she did not answer the phone from that period onwards.
Kath, I still haven't heard from you, honey. Look, I'll wait till about 5 o'clock, and if you don't call me, I'll presume you're not coming.
It appeared that Kathleen had been murdered sometime after 6 p.m. that Thursday night. Cartons of milk and newspapers delivered from the Friday onward remained in her front yard.
Report was received from the forensic entomologist, which estimated the time of death at somewhere between 9 p.m. on Thursday the 26th of February and 3 a.m. the following morning.
So who had the time, opportunity and reason to kill Kathleen?
My first thought when I discovered she'd been murdered was that it would be involved with the Cat Protection Society of Queensland in some way.
Kathleen Marshall was the president of that society, a position that wasn't supported by all of its members.
How would you describe the Cat Protection Society?
Off the planet. There was no dealing with them. They were just totally fanatical.
What has emerged is a story of feline fanatics engaged in bitter brawling.
Do you think these very passionate feelings within the society could have led someone to murder?
Yes. Quite frankly, yes.
The Cat Protection Society of Queensland was larger than I had ever imagined. There was quite a lot of money coming in from bequests, from wills. Most of the money came from wills.
There was quite a bit of money. There were 2 bequests coming through. The biggest one, I think, was $350,000.
I know that from talking to members of the society, there have been some years of friction in relation to the spending of the finances and how the money had been spent, who'd be getting what.
There was 2 distinct camps. You were either in Kathleen Marshall's camp or you were in Virginia Houston's camp. There was no in between.
Virginia Houston was a former director and treasurer of the society, and according to her, she'd been unceremoniously and unfairly dumped.
Virginia seemed to think that the society was her baby. And I believe she was completely devastated that she was actually removed from the board.
If you're investigating any crime, obviously motive becomes a very strong indicator as to who may have committed the crime. And at that stage, for want of motive, we had a disagreement, a known disagreement between 2 people who were members of the Cat Protection Society of Queensland, one being Kathleen Marshall and one being Virginia Houston. They were at loggerheads.
Literally. 6 weeks before her death, Virginia had barged into Kathleen's home, which was the registered office of the Cat Protection Society.
Kathleen told them to get out, that They couldn't come in. Virginia said, it's the registered office, it's my right to come in. Kathleen rang 000 on the phone, asked the police to come. She said there's a mad woman in the house.
There was no doubt who Rhoda and her friends believed killed Kathleen, right from day one.
Just before the crime squad arrived, this car drove past and it was Virginia. I was horrified. I just gasped. The police officer came up to us and said, what's wrong? And Glenda said, oh, the murderer's just driven past.
But was Virginia Houston's hatred of Kathleen that strong that she would commit murder?
I do recall that in a conversation with the pathologist, he did say due to the nature of the injuries and the fact that they were so shallow in the way of the stab wounds, he said it would suggest either a weak person or it could have been a female.
Kathleen Marshall, the president of the Cat Protection Society, had been fighting bitterly with Virginia Houston just weeks before her murder. Police believed Virginia had the motive and the passion to kill Kathleen.
She's been a key murder suspect, but Virginia Houston isn't in hiding and isn't hindering police inquiries.
I've done nothing, I've got nothing to hide, so I'm quite happy to talk to the police whenever they want to talk to me.
I remember it was on the Friday that we interviewed Virginia Houston. We collected her in the morning from her house and we conducted an interview at the Nunda CIB, which lasted all day.
I said I had a lot of information, and I did. I had a lot of information about the society, about the inside knowledge of the society, and as a good citizen, I wanted to help the police.
Virginia quite openly suggested that she had animosity towards Kathleen Marshall, didn't try and deny it, didn't try and deny that she was having problems with the other board members of the Cat Protection Society of Queensland. She didn't deny the fact that she had been round to Kathleen Marshall's house and obtained entry into her residence against Kathleen's will.
I mean, the police seem to have this idea of hate, but I've never hated anyone in my life. I disliked the way she behaved, the way she treated people, but as for being violent, well, that was just wasn't part of me.
She was confident in her manner. She knew the types of questions that we would ask, and she had almost prepared responses to our questions.
She was asked directly if she had killed Kathleen Marshall.
Jeff Marsh turned round to me and said, did you murder her? And I was just stunned. And that was when I realised that they were looking at me as well. I couldn't believe it. And I'm just sitting there shaking my head, you know, I can't believe this, I can't believe this. So I just said, no, I've done nothing. You know, just like in disbelief, you know, disbelief that anyone could even ask me such a question, you know. He was somebody who totally law-abiding, never had so much as anything more than a parking fine.
At the conclusion of the interview, I was not prepared to say that Virginia was not involved at that time and that some of the issues that she had raised and versions that she had provided required further investigation.
We had a search warrant for Virginia Houston's house and her house was searched.
And I said, well, you don't need a search warrant. I said, you can search my house, you can, you know, take my fingerprints, whatever, you know.
Ms Houston admits to having a heated argument with Dr Marshall just weeks before her death, and police have now questioned her and searched her house and car.
We were looking for physical evidence such as blood, hairs and fibres, and more importantly, the weapon used to commit the offence.
And to have police raids and SES people going through your property trying to find a knife or something, you know. You're just in shock. You just go around in shock. You just can't believe something like this is happening.
But no weapon was found. And while the spraying of luminol to detect any traces of blood looked promising, the lab results returned the samples as negative.
There was no evidence obtained from that residence to suggest any connection with the murder of Kathleen Marshall.
But Virginia Houston remained a strong suspect, and her alibis were being checked, starting with her tarot card reader, Patrick Hanrahan.
The members of the Cat Protection Society of Queensland and associates of Kathleen Marshall and associates of Virginia Houston were involved, actively involved, in the psychic readings and the spirit world. When I first went to interview Patrick Hanrahan, he refused to talk to me unless he could read my cards to find out whether I was a person suitable to be spoken to. And that was quite bizarre, because those areas were foreign to myself and all the other investigators on the case. I had to find someone from the office who was prepared to come with me and not break out in laughter. And so it was pretty frustrating, but I found someone who came along and they were able to contain their laughter until after I'd obtained the information from Patrick. Because we had to get information from him. He was the alibi for Virginia Houston up until 4 p.m.
And you can do healing, hands-on healing.
He confirmed initially that he was with Virginia all afternoon doing a reading, and then at 4 o'clock Virginia dropped him at a medical appointment, and he hadn't seen her since then.
Virginia's alibis were checking out, but police wanted to re-interview a woman who said she was with Virginia on the night they believed Kathleen Marshall was murdered.
Corinne Welsh is the lady who provided the, you might say, alibi, for want of a better word, from 5 p.m. until 11 p.m. on the Thursday night. Obviously a very critical time period in the investigation.
According to Corinne Welsh, the two women had spent that time doing a mail-out for the society. Now, in her second meeting with police, her recollection changed.
And it was during that interview she gave us further information to suggest that Virginia was not with her the entire evening.
When Kathleen Marshall was murdered, her friends and colleagues pointed to one person as being the killer: Virginia Houston. Virginia had fought with Kathleen in the past and readily admitted there was no love lost between them.
I disliked the way she behaved, the way she treated people, but as for being violent, well, that was just wasn't part of me.
Virginia had given alibis for the time period that police believed Kathleen Marshall was murdered, but it now appeared one had holes in it.
Re-interviewing everyone that supplied information in relation to the movements of Virginia Houston in the week prior to Kathleen Marshall's body being located, we were in the process of re-interviewing Corinne Welsh, who was an integral part of an alibi, for want of a better word, of Virginia Houston for the Thursday night, the 26th of February. And it was during that interview she gave us further information to suggest that Virginia was not with her the entire evening.
It was the first solid lead detectives had in their case against Virginia Houston, but it wouldn't go very far. A phone call from the forensic laboratory would change the entire direction of the investigation.
Whilst we were interviewing Corinne Welsh and we'd established that time frame, or that time gap, Ken Cox rang the office and told us that there was male blood at the crime scene.
5 of the 25 blood samples from the veterinary surgery, including blood found on the cardboard below the shattered louver window, had yielded DNA that wasn't Kathleen's, nor Virginia Houston's, but that of a male.
It was rather exciting news to find male blood, but until we link it to somebody, it's of no value. All we're looking for in the early proceedings is male blood with an unknown name attached to it.
I thought, well, at least it gives us our investigation a direction to follow now. We have to find a male person who is linked to the deceased in some way, and we had a target. At least we had a target.
Police now believe Dr. Marshall was murdered by a male, and that detectives have taken blood from several men connected to the society.
As it was male DNA, all men who knew Kathleen were required to give a blood sample, including me, for DNA testing.
During this DNA exclusion process, there were approximately 42 persons identified. This was obviously time and labour intensive.
In those days we had to take blood. It was in the initial stages of DNA sampling.
The blood samples collected from Dr. Marshall's associates will be matched with the results of blood and tissue taken from the murder scene.
On the consent form, you had to admit that you're a suspect. The way the consent form was written is, I admit I'm a suspect in the murder of Kathleen Frances Marshall, and I hereby give consent for police to take my blood, hair samples, that sort of thing. That can be a bit confronting to someone who has no involvement at all in the matter and really is only a distant link to Kathleen Marshall.
Of course, I was under the suspicion that we were all suspects at first, but we later found out it was to eliminate people from being suspects.
When I was asked to give DNA, I realised the last thing you should do is refuse, because that never looks good. And if you give it and everything is kosher and they can come up with the right answer, it means you're in the clear.
In fact, the 42 males tested were all clear. And now police were targeting the men in Virginia Houston's life. One was her ex-boyfriend.
We found that gentleman at a boarding house in the Fortitude Valley area, and his DNA was requested, and he refused to give his DNA. Now, the detectives at the time had the foresight to observe his movements for a period of time after he declined the DNA sample, and they identified him spitting on the ground. They then captured his DNA from the spit on the ground. So that DNA was taken away. He was still at the boarding house. It'd be a matter of days, we'd be able to either exclude him or say it's him. The very next morning, the boarding house owner had rung us and said that he's just hopped in a taxi cab with his bags packed. We made some investigation and identified that that cab was going to the transit centre, went across to the transit centre and located this gentleman who'd purchased a ticket under a false name from Brisbane to Sydney. So he obviously becomes a person that now is at the top of the list and very much a person of interest in this investigation. He's male, he knows Virginia Houston, he won't give DNA, and he's trying to leave the state.
Brisbane vet Kathleen Marshall had been brutally murdered in her surgery. Virginia Houston had been the prime suspect until investigators discovered male blood at the crime scene. Now they were on the trail of one of Virginia's ex-boyfriends, who had refused to give a DNA sample.
We then take him into custody, interview him, and after a short amount of time he volunteers his DNA, his fingerprints, his clothes and his bag. And he said, you can test it all, there'll be no blood on it. I'm not involved in this crime in any way, shape or form. Unfortunately, the DNA that came back from he did not match the crime scene, and there was nothing on the clothes to indicate that he'd been anywhere near the deceased's house. So therein ended that line of investigation. But these things take time. That takes a number of days to sort out. So we move on. Then you go back to Patrick Hanrahan, and we asked him if he was prepared to give his DNA, and he said, yeah, I'll give you my DNA sample. A week later, he comes back negative.
Patrick Hanrahan told police about another palm reader, Andrew Fitzherbert, who worked at the church and was the de facto partner of Ruth Bennett. Ruth was a member of the Cat Protection Society and an ally of Virginia Houston.
But all that did for me was say, OK, well, there's another male I've got to exclude because, you know, he's now added to the list of associates of Virginia Houston. Ruth Bennett is an identified associate of Virginia Houston, and Andrew Fitzherbert is her male partner. So I'll have to get him excluded as well.
And there was another man police were yet to exclude, John Wilson, who had made the 1 o'clock appointment for his cat.
We could not find John Wilson. We didn't know who he was. Did another press release asking for anyone to come forward who'd been to the surgery, and we actually specified on that day.
We are interested in talking to people that attended Kathleen Marshall's house in the last week of February 1998, especially those people that attended with a sick or injured animal.
He still didn't come forward. It was then only on the 12th of June that Ruth Bennett appeared in the Courier Mail nursing a Siamese cat. This is when we start to put it all together. Ruth Bennett lives with Andrew Fitzherbert, he's a partner, and they've got a Siamese cat. The Licciardis have seen a man carrying a Siamese cat walking towards the house.
He was standing within about a foot of the back of the bus, and I thought, well, if I mess up the clutch, I'll hit him and the cat, and I didn't want that, so I called him and I said, would you mind moving away from the vehicle, sir? And he didn't respond, he didn't move, he just stood there.
It now appeared the detectives had found their elusive John Wilson. But before they could jump directly to that conclusion, they needed to confirm with the Licciardis that he was the man they saw on the day Kathleen died.
There was no photograph on record of Andrew Fitzherbert by the Queensland Police or any other police service in Australia, but we identified that he had a passport, and a passport photo had been taken some years prior. We obtained a copy of that passport photograph and displayed that to the Licciardis in the usual format of a photo board.
They asked us to have a look at some photos and see what, if we could identify the man. I picked, I think it was number 9. I know it was down on the left-hand corner of the board. And the only difference that I could see in that picture was that it was a smiling picture. The man I saw was definitely not smiling.
Mrs. Licciardi was able to identify Andrew Fitzherbert from the photo board as the person that she had seen outside Kathleen Marshall's residence on Thursday the 26th of February.
Andrew, do you have any grounds at all for associating in any way with this man?
Have you had contact with Kathleen Marshall?
No.
Have you ever
met Kathleen Marshall at all under any circumstance? All I know of I have met Virginia Houston. I know Virginia Houston fairly well.
Have you ever been to Kathleen Marshall's street or to her house?
I don't even know where she lives.
Have you ever spoken to her over the telephone? No.
That denial was key information for the detectives. They knew that a phone call had come into Kathleen Marshall's home from the Bennett Fitzherbert residence 2 days before Kathleen had died, and was potentially the call that set up John Wilson's 1 o'clock appointment.
We stated that we had direct links between his residence and Kathleen Marshall's residence on the days prior to. He denied this, and we again reiterated that we had the links through phone records. At this point, he began to physically shake almost to the point where it was uncontrollable.
I haven't met the woman.
Yeah, that's right. That's fine, Andrew. No, and that's
If that's the case, you're a person that has nothing to lose and everything to gain.
And Andrew, all that we're asking you to do is supply a specimen to eliminate you from our inquiries. That's it. That's the bottom line.
Got to test Andrew because he made an application to join the Cat Society and he was rejected. So that's
Well, Ruth, we don't know. All we
have heard of that.
Ruth, all went no.
I mean, we've got alibis for the whole weekend.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But all I'm saying is we can finish this up in a few minutes. That's all that we're saying to you, Ruth.
Well, I think I'm going to say no. No, I am not going to give you samples. I will give you samples if and when. I'm not going to give you samples. It's as simple as that.
We took him into custody. He declined an interview. He was what we would classify as someone who was very DNA aware. He had quite literally sat in the one position for over 6 hours, had not gone to the toilet, had not drunk anything. He knew what he could and couldn't do to ensure that he wouldn't leave traces of his DNA.
The latest focus of the homicide inquiry left Nunda Police Station this afternoon, accompanied by his lawyer, despite intense speculation that police were about to announce a breakthrough in the investigation of murdered vet Kathleen Marshall. The man was released after more than 6 hours of questioning. Police had intended taking a blood sample, but the move was thwarted in the courts after a magistrate ruled there was insufficient evidence.
Police were now going to have to find another strategy to get the DNA they so desperately needed to nab the person they believed was Kathleen's killer.
Mr. Fitzherbert. How are you?
Well, not bad, but we would prefer that you did not come through the door, thank you.
Andrew Fitzherbert was an unlikely suspect in the murder of Kathleen Marshall. But when he was identified as the mysterious John Wilson, who hadn't been found on the day Kathleen was murdered, their suspicions arose.
Andrew, and as I was saying to you, you seem to be a reasonable man. And if I can put one more appeal to you, is that this can all be finalised in a matter of seconds if we can obtain those samples, and that's all that we need to do. We can get out of your hair and eliminate you as a suspect, as a person of interest in relation to this matter.
Well, I'm not giving my consent. It's as simple as that.
But I can't understand the reasons why.
Why, if he was innocent, why was he causing such hassle to get his DNA? You know, was he standing on principle that much? You know, wouldn't it have been easier just to say, OK, you can have it, rather than cause the police to drag him into court?
While police couldn't force Andrew Fitzherbert to give blood unless they were prepared to charge him with murder, they were able to get a search warrant for his home. There, they hoped to find items that would contain samples of his DNA.
Execution of search warrant. We have a warrant to execute. We'd appreciate if you could put the dog out the back for us while we search the house.
Hello, Mr. Fitzherbert. How are you? Well, not bad, but we would prefer that you did not come through the door, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Fitzherbert, what's happened is we've got a search warrant for these premises.
A search warrant for the premises?
He was quite surprised to see us. He didn't seem prepared for the fact that we'd come armed with a search warrant and were looking for personal items.
Yes, in other words, you have a right to remain silent. You understand that, yes? You have the right to contact the solicitor if you wish.
Daddy, can't you shut that door?
Ruth Pennant was abusive towards us. She wasn't happy at all that we were there. We'd already been with her de facto for some 8 hours that day. We'd failed in a court attempt to obtain his DNA through legal means, and she believed this was just nothing more than a case of police harassment.
During the course of the search, we took possession of a number of personal items which related directly to Andrew Fitzherbert. These items included his hairbrush, his toothbrush, his pillowcase, his sheets, his socks, his coffee cup, and a hanky which he had in his pocket.
Among those items, it was the last. Fitzherbert's handkerchief held the DNA evidence that put him at the crime scene.
You've been investigating a matter like this for some months, trying to identify who the DNA belonged to. We now had an identification. So obviously he had to justify his DNA being at a crime scene.
Andrew Richard Fitzherbert was first arrested 2 days ago for refusing a police bid to obtain a blood sample for DNA testing. But the 49-year-old was released after a court ruling found police could only demand blood if he was arrested for the murder. That happened early this morning when he presented himself at Brisbane Watch House with a lawyer.
While a handkerchief was an indication they had the right man, it could be argued that it was used by someone else. But now, with the charge of murder, police could insist on a blood sample from Fitzherbert for comparison testing.
Andrew Fitzherbert's blood was an exact match for the blood that was located in the surgery at Kathleen Marshall's residence.
17 months after her death, Kathleen's accused went to trial.
This morning, Andrew Fitzherbert pleaded not guilty to murder. Prosecutors claim the most damning evidence is based on DNA testing. The jury was told a magistrate ordered Fitzherbert to give blood, which matched samples taken at the scene. DNA tests revealed only one person in 14 times 10 to the power of 15 could match. The Crown claimed there was no word for such a number, the extraordinary odds proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Fitzherbert is the killer.
And if there was any argument that he bled there at some other occasion than at the time of the murder, one critical piece of forensic evidence would seal his fate.
The plastic bag on the surgery scene was identified as being a mixture of the deceased blood and an unknown male's blood. But I think it was significant finding male and female blood together in the one mixture, because we could say that the offender and the deceased had shed blood at the same time, and in doing so, their blood had come into contact together.
Kathleen Marshall's murder has been likened to a sensational mystery novel. This afternoon, the final chapter concluded when Fitzherbert was found guilty. The jury took 3.5 hours to return its verdict. Judge Ken McKenzie immediately sentenced Fitzherbert to 15 years jail, conceding if it hadn't been for an explosion in genetic technology, he may have walked free.
Evidence of alibi was offered during the trial, but the evidence, the scientific evidence we had in relation to the DNA at the crime scene, along with his denials of ever being at the crime scene, were too compellable to the jury.
When he was found guilty, I don't think I was really surprised, but you've got to have a reason for doing something. So where was the motive for this murder? And the only thing that we could think of, the motive was in the cat.
During the course of the investigation, it was identified that Andrew Fitzherbert and Ruth Bennett were the owner of 2 Siamese cats, Jasper and Zilla. Zilla went missing around about the time that Kathleen Marshall's body was located.
Now, the cat was pregnant. He may have presented himself there with the cat and something's happened to the cat.
We're wondering if he could have perhaps brought a cat to Kathleen, the cat escaped or something like that. An argument started and Fitzherbert crashed against the louvers and got himself cut. There are various theories to that end wandering around.
There's a lot of people who can't, they just find it so frustrating that they were put through all this pain and suffering and trauma, and they still don't know what happened.
It doesn't frustrate me. I think it frustrates more the people that knew Kathleen Marshall. They'd like an explanation of why a person's life could be ended for what appears like a few theories that it might be over a cat. They'd like to think there's something more to it, but until Andrew Fitzherbert talks, we'll never know, or they'll never know.
Andrew Fitzherbert can apply for parole in 2014, but unless he admits to Kathleen's murder and shows some remorse, his release is unlikely.